Ronald Sanchez Jr. was born on March 11, 1977, and raised in Garden Grove, California, and went by Ron. After graduating from Santiago High School in 1994, he enlisted in the United States Army the following year. He then served as a combat engineer until December 2011, and during that time, he did 3 tours in Iraq. Unfortunately, according to his wife at the time, Elizabeth Sanchez, Ron returned with PTSD and combat-related injuries and was subsequently medically discharged. After that, he didn't enjoy being around people and wouldn't even go to the grocery store during the day. While Elizabeth wanted to help him, Ron didn't like talking about what he had experienced. At some point, they divorced and moved on to other people, but remained in contact. After that, the Department of Veterans Affairs suggested he move to Oklahoma City, where the VA had multiple recreational programs for recovering vets. While there, he began to rediscover his love for the outdoors and became involved in biking, boat racing, and horseback riding. Even with the PTSD, he was described as a very gentle and kind individual who was loved by everyone. In 2018, Ron met Brenda Kelly at a local hiking club, and the two began dating. Around that same time, he was training to hike the Appalachian Trail and was given the trail name Stronghold. He then set off on the trail in early 2019. Unfortunately, not long into the hike, he began having knee and shoulder problems and had to leave the trail for several weeks. He had stopped at the Gooder-Gover Hostel in Franklin, North Carolina, and befriended the manager, Colin Gooder. Since Ron needed to recover, Colin offered to let him stay longer in exchange for helping him run the hostel. Once he was healed enough to continue his hike, he made it to Damascus, Virginia, which is about 467 miles from the start of the trail. However, at this point, he was tired and ready to go home and made a call to Brenda. She then drove all the way from Oklahoma City, picked him up, and they returned home. However, after a few days, he decided to return and finish the hike, so she dropped him back off in Damascus. In May of 2019, Ron was 545 miles into his journey when he joined up with 3 other hikers. On May 10th, they decided to set up camp for the night in Wythe County, Virginia, close to Crawfish Trail. That night, another man by the name of James Lewis Jordan, whose trail name was Sovereign, arrived at the campsite. They were all a little creeped out when they heard him talking to himself, but brushed it off. However, as they sat around the campfire, they could hear him talking to his dog, playing his guitar, and singing incoherently. Once nightfall set in, things took a horrible turn when Jordan began threatening them, saying he was going to set their tents on fire. Around midnight, he ran into the woods, and Ron and the 3 other hikers decided to break camp and leave. They were in the process of packing up when Jordan returned with a machete. 2 of the hikers took off running north on the trail, followed closely by Jordan, who was yelling, "Why are you hunting me?" Eventually, Jordan gave up and returned to the camp, where Ron and a female hiker named Kirby Morrill were. Kirby had been on the trails for weeks and had heard about Jordan and his odd behavior. She even encountered him once and said she went full Canadian by being super nice and petting his dog, Felicia. She also sent her husband, Alan Beck, who was back in Nova Scotia, a message that said Jordan was near her. Once the other 2 hikers had traveled about 4 miles down the trail, they called 911 at 2:30 a.m., saying that a man was chasing them with a machete. Once Jordan was back at the campsite, he continued his threats, prompting Ron to call 911 from his cell phone. Meanwhile, Kirby had packed her stuff up and began retreating when she heard Ron ask her to wait up. She turned around just in time to see Ron falling to the ground after Jordan stabbed him in the upper torso. Jordan then began chasing Kirby down. When he got close, she decided to stop, raise her arms, and surrender. He then began stabbing her as well, causing her to fall to the ground. She then made a decision to play dead, which ultimately saved her life. Once he fled the scene, she got up and began rushing south on the trail. She continued until she found some campers, who then helped her hike 6 more miles to a trailhead. At 3:12 a.m., they called 911 and reported the stabbings. She was then transported to the Bristol Regional Medical Center in Bristol, Tennessee, where she was treated for her injuries, which included a severely injured right hand, gashes across her face and fingers, and multiple wounds to her left leg. Despite the 40 lacerations and 51 staples, when she called Allen that afternoon, she still expressed her interest in finishing the 1,600 miles on the Appalachian Trail. Meanwhile, the International Emergency Response Coordination Center had received the SOS from Ron's phone. Sadly, when a team arrived at the campsite at 6:15 on Saturday morning, they found Ron's body with the machete lying nearby. From there, their tracker dog led them to a bloody Jordan, who was quickly taken into custody. As they dug into Jordan's past, they realized he had an extensive criminal record and multiple reports from people on the trail about his very bizarre behavior. He had even spent time in a Tennessee jail in April 2019, where they attempted to buy him a bus ticket home, but he refused and returned to the trail. Over the years, he had been in and out of hospitals for his mental issues, but never stayed long enough to get help. Even when he was there, he refused to take medications. Jordan's father had died of a drug overdose when he was 6 years old. This left him and his younger brother in the care of their mother. Growing up, they lived in low-income housing in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, his mother was an alcoholic and allowed Jordan to wander the streets with no supervision. He rarely went to school and started drinking as a child. By the time he was 13 or 14, he was arrested with a friend for breaking into a car. Those who grew up with Jordan knew him as JJ and said that when his paranoia flared up, his pupils would dilate and he would slip into a state that they called the shimmer. After being arrested for the murder of Ron and attempted murder of Kirby, he was ordered to undergo a mental evaluation. He was then determined unfit to stand trial in order to spend the rest of his life in a psychiatric facility. As for Kirby, 4 months after the horrible incident, she was already back out hiking and made it to the summit of Maine's Mount Katahdin. Jace Yohan Eubanks was born on March 28, 2017, to parents Jamal Youssef Eubanks and Rakia Del Valle. In 2021, 4-year-old Jace and his 6-year-old brother were living with their mother, Rakia, and her evil boyfriend, 27-year-old Jeremiah Johnson, in Brooklyn, New York. Interestingly, I combed the internet for photos of Johnson, but was unable to find any. Johnson had a criminal history and was reported 3 different times during a 4-year period for acts of domestic violence and child abuse. He also had a warrant out for his arrest for violating the conditions of his supervised release. On August 26, 2021, while Jace and his brother were at the Strong Place for Hope Daycare Center, employees noticed injuries on their bodies and called the police and the Administration for Children's Services, also known as ACS. In response to that report, ACS visited the apartment where the children lived. Rakia and Johnson, along with the children, were then brought to the ACS office for an interview. While there, ACS also noticed the injuries on the children's bodies. The children were then interviewed by a nonprofit organization called Safe Horizons. Once the investigation was complete, the police requested a medical exam of the children, but never followed up to ensure it was done. ACS discovered Johnson's warrant and ensured the kids they would protect them, but in the end, they released them back to the care of Rakia and Johnson and determined that the care they were receiving was suitable. As you can expect, this was a horrible mistake. 3 days later, on August 29th, ACS visited the apartment and once again determined the children were receiving suitable care. Sadly, they couldn't have been more wrong. Around 5 a.m. on September 12, 2021, Johnson woke Rakia up and told her that Jace was having trouble breathing and had collapsed. She quickly called 911, and when the police arrived, they found her waving them down while holding Jace. He was rushed to Brooklyn Hospital, but they were sadly unable to save him. The official cause of death was battered child syndrome. Due to all the injuries that the medical examiner found, his death was ruled a homicide, and Johnson was subsequently arrested and charged with his murder. As for Rakia, she was never charged, even though many believe she was well aware of the abuse going on in the apartment. If officers and ACS had followed up and ensured that Jace received a medical examination, including x-rays, they would have seen the real extent of his injuries, which included skull and rib fractures. It's also unclear why Johnson wasn't originally arrested when his outstanding warrant was discovered. After Jace's death, his biological father, Jamal, filed a suit against the city and ACS, claiming they ignored clear warning signs that ultimately led to his son's death. The state of New York investigated ACS and found that they had constant systemic failures and poorly trained staff. On April 17, 2024, Johnson pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. The same year that Jace died, 3 other children who ACS knew were victims of child abuse also died. Hallie Phillips was born to parents Lance and Angie on January 17, 2002. She was described as a person who loved animals, especially horses. That love led her to become a very talented barrel racer. She was also known for her contagious smile and cheerful spirit. After graduating from Blair Oaks High School in 2020, she enrolled at the University of Missouri, where she studied animal sciences. In 2022, 20-year-old Hallie was still in college and lived about 15 minutes east of Jefferson City, Missouri, and 40 minutes away from the school. She was also dating 23-year-old Joshua Wilbers, and they lived together in a trailer on the property. Unfortunately, that November, a horrible accident occurred. On Sunday, November 27th, Hallie was sitting at home, relaxing, while Joshua was nearby cleaning his new .22 caliber bolt-action Savage rifle. He was about to take it outside to test it when she asked him about the firing pin. So he removed the magazine and cycled the bolt back at least twice to make sure the chamber was empty. Believing the gun was empty, he pulled the trigger. To his shock, the gun fired and struck Hallie in the face, who was sitting about 6 feet away. In a panic, he carried her outside along with the gun. He then called 911. When officers arrived at 1:30 p.m., they found Hallie unconscious on the ground. She was then flown to University Hospital in Columbia, Missouri, where she sadly died 90 minutes later. Investigators checked the home security footage and confirmed that he had indeed carried her outside and thrown the gun on the ground. When they found the rifle, there was no magazine, but there was a spent .22 caliber shell in the chamber. Everything at the scene matched what Joshua said. 2 days later, he was charged with first-degree involuntary manslaughter. Almost 2 years later, on July 12, 2024, a judge found him guilty of the charges after he waived his right to a trial by jury. Jason Scott Platipodis was born in Indiana, the middle child of triplets, on November 25, 1981, to Bill Platipodis and Jan Westergren. He stood out from his triplet siblings, Jessica and Jeff, due to his round face, which led to the nickname Chubbs. In 2001, he graduated from Valparaiso High School, and then in 2021, he received his associate's degree from Ivy Tech Community College. He then worked to become a journeyman carpenter and was able to make a career out of it. He loved his family, especially his daughter Piper, who he fought to get custody of. He also loved fishing and collecting hats from his favorite sports team, the Chicago Bears. As a young adult, he sadly became addicted to opioids, which he was taking for back pain. However, he hated the addiction and decided to get clean when his daughter was born. In early 2022, 41-year-old Jason, now 5 years sober, was living in Indianapolis, Indiana, and working in construction. Unfortunately, he relapsed, and it had dire consequences. On January 3rd at 7:15 a.m., 6-year-old Piper called 911 and told the dispatcher that she couldn't wake up her father. When EMTs arrived, they discovered that Jason had died sometime during the night. When his brother Jeff arrived, he got Jason's phone and found text messages between him and a contact called Johnny Boy. That's when he realized, to his shock, that Jason had fallen off the wagon. He then took the phone and gave it to a detective at the police department. Investigators then got to work tracking down Johnny Boy, whose real name was Jonathan Sperling. Through their investigative work, they discovered that Jason had learned that Sperling was heading to Chicago to get some drugs and asked if he would bring him some back. However, what he bought was a lethal dose of fentanyl. While Sperling was aware of this, he never warned Jason when he sold it to him. Investigators found proof of this in a text that he later sent Jason that read, "Promise it did the trick but wasn't overwhelming." After Jason and his daughter, who were in Valparaiso for the weekend, got the drugs from Sperling, they drove back to Indianapolis. He then overdosed in the middle of the night. When Sperling was brought in for questioning, he lied and said he only gave Jason heroin. Regardless, he was charged with dealing a controlled substance that resulted in death. Since 2018, due to a new law, investigators have been seeking prosecution against drug dealers who knowingly sell lethal amounts of drugs to users. However, most of the cases have been hard to prove, and without the text message between Jason and Sperling, he may have never been arrested. He was then able to post bond on April 4th, 2023, and was set to stand trial on May 30th. While there are no official updates on his charges, according to his inmate records, he was sentenced to a year in jail for possession of narcotic drugs on March 4th, 2024. Most likely, this is the result of the original charge being downgraded. I would love to know what y'all think. Do you think drug dealers should be held accountable for the deaths of their users? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Beth Harmon Potts was born in Manti, Utah on August 20th, 1914. Her first marriage was to Clyde Tidwell, but he later died in an automobile accident on September 19th, 1960. She then married William Potts on November 5th, 1971. He also tragically passed away in a car accident in 1983. However, this time, she was in the car and was badly injured, causing her to lose her eyesight and much of her mobility. That same year, she began living in the Old Farm residential community near Murray, Utah, and was a member of the Mill Creek LDS First Ward. In 1990, 76-year-old Beth joined her 49-year-old daughter, Kay Tiede, and her family at a cabin they owned in the Beaver Springs Ranch subdivision in Camas, Utah, for the Christmas holiday. Also there was Kay's husband, Ralph, and two of their three children, Lene and Tricia. Unfortunately, this would turn out to be a Christmas from hell. On December 22, 1990, while they were all out shopping an hour away in Salt Lake City, 25-year-old Fawn Lester Taylor and 21-year-old Edward Deli broke into the cabin. Both men were on parole and had been staying at a halfway house before they decided to hitchhike to a cabin in the area that Taylor's family owned. Once there, they began breaking into multiple cabins before stumbling upon the Tiede's family cabin. This is the actual video they recorded using the family's camcorder.
I don't know. Okay. I don't think I got all of this.
How come your light flashing on the room that?
I don't know.
Find out.
How am I supposed to find out?
Instructions. And Lene. Come on, cat. Oh, wow.
What is it?
Baseball card.
While waiting for the family to return, they began opening the presents they found under the Christmas tree.
Okay. Let's see a couple of them.
Oh, the football and basketball.
Show them this way. Turn them this way.
The first family members to arrive back at the cabin were Beth and Kay. When they walked in, they were immediately shot and killed. The men then dragged their bodies across the living room floor and out onto the deck and covered them with a blanket and snow. Rolf and his daughters were a little bit behind because you had to park in a parking lot across the street and ride snowmobiles up to the cabin. When Ralph arrived and entered the cabin, he was also shot multiple times. They then robbed him of his belongings, doused him with gasoline, and set the cabin on fire. Unbeknownst to the men, he was only pretending to be dead and had actually survived the murder attempt. After setting the cabin on fire, they kidnapped 16-year-old Tricia and 20-year-old Lene and drove the snowmobiles back toward the parking lot. Meanwhile, Rolf, who was now on fire, ran to the shower and quickly stripped off his snowsuit. Once he was safe from the fire, a bleeding Rolf jumped on another snowmobile and took off after the men. His brother, Randy, had just arrived for a visit and was standing near the subdivision gate when he noticed the girls on the snowmobiles with two unknown men. Not thinking much of it, he waved, but found it strange they didn't wave back. The girls later said it was because they didn't want Randy to be shot as well. He followed them to the parking lot and tried to talk to them as they all got into the car and drove off. As they were driving off, Tricia tried to give Randy a sign that they were in trouble by putting her hands up, but Taylor yelled at her to put them back down. He knew immediately something was wrong. Minutes later, he was even more confused when he saw another snowmobile approaching with a man on it that didn't have a coat, gloves, or helmet on, even though it was below freezing outside. He was shocked when he realized it was his brother Ralph. Ralph quickly explained that his wife and mother-in-law were dead and the girls had just been abducted. So Randy put Ralph in his car and they began chasing the suspects. Even though it was 1990 and cell phones were extremely rare, Randy thankfully had one, but the service was very spotty. He kept calling 911 but wasn't getting through. He was driving so fast that he actually caught up to the suspects after about 4 or 5 miles. All the while, Ralph lay in the back seat, dying. Finally, the 911 call went through, and he was able to notify the police of the situation. Deputies took over the chase, and Ralph was airlifted to the hospital. During the high-speed chase, speeds of over 100 miles per hour were reached, and eventually, Taylor lost control, hit a guardrail, and wrecked the car in a ravine. Once everyone regained their senses and Taylor knew it was over, he told Deli that it was time for the final part of their plan. That included him shooting Deli and turning the gun on himself because they didn't want to go back to jail. However, Deli changed his mind, got out of the car, and began shooting at the officers, and was quickly joined by Taylor. Once the men were out of ammo, they surrendered, and the girls were rescued safe and sound. Thankfully, Ralph survived and was released from the hospital a few days later. The family had no idea that the suspects had been using their camcorder prior to the murders, and when investigators took the camera, they figured all they would see were videos of the family. In the end, Taylor was found guilty and received 2 death sentences. Deli, on the other hand, got life in prison after one juror held out against the capital murder charge. Years later, new ballistic testing showed that Deli, who was carrying a .44 Magnum, was actually the one who murdered Beth and Kay, not Taylor, who was carrying a .38 Special. Even with this new evidence and multiple appeals, he remains on death row. Ralph, who was born on September 29, 1939, and immigrated from Germany to the U.S. with his mother in 1950, sadly passed away in 2008. Before he died, he rebuilt the cabin that was partially destroyed by the fire.